When you have tons of data, gigabytes and petabytes of data for everything that we do, the easiest thing was dashboards. And when we build dashboards, now even dashboards are very overwhelming. Everybody has Tableau and ClickView and there's a Tableau dashboard for everything. But when you're actually sharing these dashboards, you never share a dashboard by itself to any executive or when you're sharing it with any stakeholder. You always write some narrative around it to say, hey, sales went up or engineering productivity went up. Whatever it is, you write some narrative and a story around the data and you say, because of XYZ, we would like to do A and B. What do you think we should do? Right? So the conversations are how you kind of share dashboards.
Hello and welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Cariappa. How do developers think? What do they care about? What are some of the constraints that they operate in? And how can you get the best out of them? Well, these are some of the questions that we delve into on this podcast with Sudheer Bandaru, the founder and CEO of Insightly. Sudheer is an engineering leader with over 2 decades' experience and has deep insights on how to align engineering teams for the best outcomes. And with Insightly, he's helping improve developer productivity, which is a very important problem, especially for growing startups post-remote. So if you're a founder or a developer or someone like me who's just curious about how this world works, this is a fantastic primer and I hope you like it. Let's get started on this episode of the Startup Operator Podcast with Sudheer Bandaru. Hey Sudheer, welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
I'm glad to be here, Roshan. Excited.
Yeah, I'm really excited to speak to you as well. As a pseudo engineer myself who wrote a few lines of code some 10 years ago, thank God I don't have to do that now. I'm very curious about how developers work. You've been an engineer for almost 2 decades now, and you're building something for your fellow engineers to be more productive. So this is kind of the perfect occasion for me to ask you all of the 101 questions, all of the noob questions, and you can help us understand this developer's mindset and so on. So I'm really excited about that.
Lovely. This is going to bring me back memories of me writing the code 15 years back, 20 years back, how I was on the other side of the table when I was managing engineers. Really looking forward, Roshan.
Awesome. Actually, let's begin with that developer's mindset, right? How do developers solve problems? How do they sequence ideas? What are their priorities? What are their challenges and so on? Can you talk about all of this stuff from a layperson's perspective in terms of what a day in the life of a typical developer is?
Yeah, the day in the life of a developer comes in the morning, they have a stand-up call, they think, okay, I'm going to work on these Jira tickets or whatever it is. And then the day begins around 10ish, 11ish. And before they start their actual work, somebody pings them for, hey, can you help me here? And then there is a business request that comes in and they say, hey, there's a escalation that comes in. And then you say, yeah, let me work on these tickets later in the afternoon. Let me address these issues. And then, product manager or somebody on the requirement side would say, hey, we'd like to discuss requirements for the next sprint. And then they get into those meetings. And, most of the times it's already 4 or 5 p.m. by the time the engineer really gets to their work sometimes. And the biggest developer productivity happens when they are in a flow, when they are not interrupted with Slack messages or interrupt meetings. When we see the data, we realize, there are very small pockets of time in a particular day where a developer can really do deep work. And we all know, it's an art, if you have to call it, there's a lot of thinking that goes into it. You were asking the question about how they solve problems. Solving problems needs a clear mindset. And for the developer to be productive, I think the first one is we need to create the space for them to be solving those problems in a very thoughtful process.
How much of this is a feature versus it's a bug, right? I mean, how much of this is something that you can iron out through processes versus this is how it is?
It's in the waterfall methodology, people were kind of taking days and months and to kind of iron out the requirements. And in the agile methodology, the whole idea is about to move fast. And it's okay to break things. It's okay to have bugs, but as long as your system and your process allows you to fix the bugs equally fast. So it's a feature and a bug is definitely, I don't think anybody, even elite engineering teams, they're trying to keep it to 0 bugs. It's more about how fast you can identify, how fast you can fix it. Correct? So that's what makes difference between a low performing, high performing engineering teams, if I have to say it. I never strive for a 0% bugs because it's when you're moving fast, it's hard to be thinking of all the different corner cases. And some of the times your environment, your information that you have on your local or staging environment is very, very different from a real-time environment. Small example, when you're testing a name, username as a field, you have people use it with all the different names. And just for fun, imagine Elon Musk has to put his son's name, right? Nobody would test for that scenario.
XXV11 something, right?
Exactly, right? That's a very on a funny side, but interestingly, there are so many accents and people from different cultures, regions, and like use their names in a very different way, and like people miss out on those things. When they get to know the product, and like when they get to know the real scenario, they got to be agile enough to go fix the bug faster. That's what I would say, bug versus feature. It's okay to have a bug as long as you can fix it faster.
So, see, this is how you know that I don't talk to a lot of developers, because I actually meant that question metaphorically, but I'm glad you answered the literal sense, right? Because actually, let's talk a little more about that, right? I mean, this aspect of quality, right, is sort of a four-letter word when it comes up with engineering teams, right? Because obviously, you have to move fast, you have to ship a lot of code. Maintaining quality sometimes gets sidetracked. So, how do you build that culture, where developers own the kind of code that they ship, they take responsibility for what happens after they deliver something as well?
See, developers definitely they take the responsibility to make sure the best code goes out and best intention. But one is end of the day, it's all about time, correct? Time versus quality. You cannot get something fast and still at a very high quality. Those are those two things don't go together. As long as we can solve for it, give them the time to create the right code, I think they will be able to kind of test it thoroughly. And we see this often actually. When you have to kind of ship things faster, the only option is you cut down on the testing, you cut down on the code review process, you cut down on the complete regression testing, and you think everything is going to be fine, and then you realize the problem. So it's the time people try to push things rather than saying making poor choices, they cut corners to move things. We don't want to miss the deadline is the most important thing. So I don't think it's intentional poor choices. It's more of a trade-off between delivering it with a slightly less quality, knowing that things may fail, but it's okay right now to move on. And rather, when I get a production bug, if people are using this feature and they know there is a corner case, they're going to come back. We know how to address it. In my teams, when I have managed the teams, I'm like, on the last day when the testing is happening, you start to see issues. And, you have two choices. Go meet the deadline and go push the feature, or say, call this out. Hey, these are the scenarios. We found these are the bugs. We know these production bugs may happen, but the probability of them happening is going to be less. So let's go push it. Right? That is where an engineering leader really makes a choice to say, this is a corner case. I don't have to miss the deadline for this. I'm calling it out. Just call it out and let everybody in the stakeholders be aware of these bugs that are found last day. So that is where we call it like go, no go decision, and like kind of identifying it and making a call about it.
Right. So if I'm hearing this correctly, it's not about having a hard and fast rule about something. It's more or less like being practical. And if you are going to assume any technical debt, do that a lot more deliberately and kind of plan for it. Right.
Exactly. And technical debt is slightly a different topic altogether. Like we always do, I'm like, no, we kind of rush things in agile. I'm like, no, kind of do things faster. And very soon, I'm like, no, with the pace at which technology is evolving and the requirements are changing, the business goals are changing. Tech debt is something that we have to create space for it. At my previous companies, I'm like, no, depending on the size of the team and the size of the company, there were times where we took like, a sprint, a full 2 week sprint as a tech debt every quarter. We made that as a rule, and we had a chat with our stakeholder CEO and everybody. You got to give us like 2 weeks every quarter. Don't ask questions what we are going to do, but trust us, we are going to be cleaning up the stuff so that we could move things faster after this second quarter, so that we could fix things faster, right? So make it a tech debt should not be a discussion of negotiation with the stakeholders every quarter or whatever you want. Make that like as a granted thing, and create space for it. Engineers would love it because a lot of engineers come and go, and they're like, no, every engineer has their own style of doing. I'm like, now if you take some of these latest frameworks, they're very opinionated in many ways. Every engineer has their own way of building these things, and you got to create the time for the new engineers not to build on the legacy, but kind of tweak it to their own style and like the latest trends they're catching up with and the latest functionalities that are coming, right? So if you don't create that, I'm like, no, it's also not an exciting thing for engineers to work on some legacy stuff. So tech debt, we have to create space for it, is what I would say.
Yeah. And otherwise, oftentimes I think it's like keeping 2 steps forward and 1 step back, right? Or even worse, I mean, maybe taking 1 step forward and 2 steps back. So in this kind of a hazy mess, right? How do you measure developer productivity? I'm sure that's some function of, the amount of code that they ship at a certain base quality that you mentioned. But is there more to it? And how do you know if a dev team is properly clocked or not? What are some leading signals as such?
Definitely, the amount of code, the amount of time clock are not going to help a business in any way. And it's not going to help the developer in any way. What matters is, I'm like, I need to deliver a particular feature to the end user, that the user is going to use it and generate some revenue or value to the business. And it could be one line, it could be a million lines. Nobody cares about it, right? So the metrics should be more outcome driven, not output driven. There is a fundamental principle we follow while we bring in metrics and data driven culture. And lines of code, or like, to say what time they spent, what time did they work, all of those things are not going to help the business in any way. What matters is developer productivity is about, is my engineering team delivering something of value to the end user and with a good quality? And that could be 5 lines of code, and that could be 500 lines of code. Doesn't matter if it is solving a user problem, because the business by itself is not trying to make the engineers write more code. Business's goal is to solve a problem that the end user is facing, correct? So developer productivity, traditionally it has been measured by lines of code and what time they come in, what time they go, how much time they spend on the IDE, what browsers they're visiting. In fact, Google was tracking what browsers people were using and where they were spending time. And they interestingly, during the tracking process, sorry for this little sidetrack here, they said in the US, you have this Cobra insurance, right? And when people are switching company from one company to the other company, they have a Cobra insurance as their gap insurance when they're switching from one company to the other. And whenever people were spending time on Cobra insurance website of Google, they realized that this guy is going to probably leave, and they said this is an attrition signal. Right. So I'm and the same thing with Marissa Mayer. I'm she was tracking about are people logging in from home or not, right? That is when she said hey, people are not logging. Everybody's working from home. The parking lots are all empty here. The then Yahoo CEO, and she said, what are people doing? I'm nobody in the office. Oh, everybody's working from home. Oh, really? Let me check it. And there are a lot of people who never even connected to their VPN, which was mandatory for somebody to contribute to Yahoo at that time. And then she said, no work from home policy and all of those things, right? Sometimes it may help for such organizations for the safety or general hygiene of the company. But for any startups or anybody else, generally the measurement should be outcome driven and something that would allow engineers to be excited about those outcomes rather than be demotivated about it, right? And they should not feel like somebody is spying on them. They should not feel like somebody is monitoring them. They should not just try to game the system just because they need to be in the good books of the management. Rather, the engineers, team leads, engineering managers, CTOs, everybody has to row the boat in the same direction with the same outcome. That is what I feel. And generally, the outcome metrics are somewhere around how many features did you release? And slightly to get a little technical, how many pull requests or merge requests did you push? And what is the quality of those things? Are you following the process? Are you just reviewing the code? Are you running it through regression testing? Are you passing all the test cases, right? So those are the basic things where we would spend time. And when there are bugs, how fast are you able to fix it? What we call is MTTR, mean time to restore, how long it takes for you to fix things that are broken, right? Some of those outcome metrics are very relevant and not trending right now with a lot of research around the standardization of engineering metrics.
Right. Interesting. This becomes further complicated when you have different engineering teams working together, right? And you have this task of aligning all of these folks. Are there some basic principles on how you should allocate work, how these different developers and teams should overlap, how you run your sprints, and so on and so forth, right? So you don't get pulled in 20 different directions and everyone ends up working really hard but not really contributing enough, right? I guess, this question is probably in the realm of org design, which, can be really complex. But if you could also give us like a 101 of how this works.
Yeah, the org design is a very complex subject, I would say. And the high level, if I have to say, what works when you're a 5% startup would not work when you're a 20% startup. And what works at 20 doesn't work at 50 and then 100. So the org design, the engineering org has to be evolving. The direction and how you're setting up your teams has to change. But one thing that's going to be common irrespective of the size of your team or the stage of where you are the teams empowered? Is the information flow happening smoothly? And this org structure is also very, very mirrors the architecture of the organization. How you define your org structure will definitely reflect in your architecture, design, application processes, and how your CI/CD works, everything else. So org structure should be in a way that if there is this something called Western org structure, which talks about exactly more around something, if somebody has a question, imagine Uber Europe has a request, marketing request, and they request somebody in the US, a product manager sitting in the US asking, hey, this is what I would like to build. And the product manager, I'm like, no, ping somebody in India to say, this is what I want to build. And then, somebody in India builds it. And then, somebody in California or Latin America is reviewing the code. Imagine the round trips it is doing. I'm like, no, nobody has one single owner of a question in time zones and all of those things. So the flow of information should be very smooth and should be fast. When people have questions, people who can answer also should be very, very much in the same team as much as possible. And it should happen faster, basically. And the org structure is something that has to be evolving as companies are growing. The second point that you were talking about was like, what kind of people you hire in those early stages and all that. Everybody in the early stages, everybody wants generalists, trying to make sure, with fewer people, you're trying to get more done. And then as you grow in the organization, I'm like, no, you're kind of growing into multiple teams, then, kind of bring in specialists where you wanted to build in deeper work, something that would be sitting, some code that would have a shelf life for a longer time. When in the beginning, early stages as an MVP, we should not overthink about code. I'm like, I haven't seen any successful startup, I'm like, no, who kept the same code what they had when they were a 5-people team. People keep on changing the architecture, people keep on changing the teams. And likewise, I've also seen teams, I'm like, who built it for 1 million users and like, no, before even testing it for 1,000 users. So we should build what really matters and like what is needed at the moment, rather than like, no, overbuilding it for the future, which is very uncertain in many ways.
It can't be easy being an engineering manager, right? If you have to marshal all of these people together, right, and get them productive, what are some do's and don'ts from an engineering manager perspective, right? How can they improve developer productivity and how should they enable their team? What are some basic principles here again?
Like you said, engineering management is not easy. It's very painful in many ways. We are burning the candle on both the ends. One, the stakeholders, customers are asking, hey, when can I get this feature? Engineers on the other end are like, burning out. What does the engineering manager do, right? It's a very painful job. And the biggest challenge here is lack of visibility into the whole communication aspect. Even to the engineers communicating it to the manager or manager communicating to the CTOs or VPs, everything becomes a very subjective conversation. The biggest thing what we can engineering manager could do is more about getting data driven. How can we kind of get in some visibility and some structured data objectivity into the discussion? That way, things don't become very subjective, things don't become toxic, conversations don't become toxic. So one, if you can find a way to say, for example, hey, scope changed. I'm like, no, hey, why did the scope change? Then, it starts a blame game. Engineers blame product managers say engineering says DevOps, and then, the QA, and then like, the cycle goes on, right? Rather, like, when you say the scope changed, if you have a data about saying that, like, how much of scope changed, then, hey, we increased our story points by 20%, and like, we're still trying to deliver this on time, which means, we are putting in 20% extra time, or we need some 20% extra time to push this deadline by. So that makes the conversation very data driven and very easy to understand and consume at all levels. So one, I would say, make it very data driven. Two, most engineering managers I have seen commit to 100% or 90% of the engineering capacity. Rule of thumb, always only commit to 70% of the engineering capacity. Because one, there is a lot of uncertainty that comes in an engineering org or in any business for that matter. And you got to be prepared to handle those fires. I'm like, we are never pushing out a completely perfect code, like we just talked earlier in the podcast. So there is always room for unexpected stuff coming in, unexpected customer requests coming in, unexpected scope changes happening. So when you kind of blocks, it's not, I wouldn't call it a sandbag. It is just creating space for the uncertainty that's going to come up. That would allow you to make sure that people don't miss the deadline so often, and they're still available, not burning out. That is one thing I would always say. And finally, it's more about when engineering managers are getting the requirements, sometimes they get the solution, not the problem. And engineering managers are just building the solution. Rather, it would be very exciting both for the engineering managers and the engineers themselves to know what problem they're solving, rather than tell that, like, no, go build this feature, go build this UI, go do this algorithm. I'm like, no, okay, I'm doing it, without knowing the context of why we are building it, what problem we are trying to solve. It's very, I'm like, shocking so many times when I myself, I'm like, I've been in conversations, the product manager or the business manager would come and say, hey, I would like to do this thing. I'm like, one of the story, I'm like, I had a CEO of a large company. He was talking to me and he was saying, hey, I need to build a UI layer on top of this, use the APIs from this particular product, build a separate UI layer on top of it, and then, build analytics like never before. Then I said, okay, why do you think we have to build a UI? Oh, this product doesn't have analytics. I said, then all you need is just like download the Excel sheet and upload it to your Tableau or something, and you get analytics. You don't need to build the whole UI and everything on top of it, right? So unless you nudge the user about what you're trying to solve, in this case your stakeholders or your customers, everything, engineers are the ones who have the best solutions. They always surprise me. When you hire smart engineers, they always come with solutions. So always try to understand the problem, not just get into the solution without knowing what you're trying to solve. And finally, engineers themselves, not every engineer spend more time with the computer than with people. So not every engineer could be loud talking about what they want or like what they feel. It's the job of the engineering manager to make sure everybody in the team speaks. There was this project that was again done by Google. I think it was Project Aristotle, if I'm not wrong, which said them like, how do best engineering teams flourish? Like, what is the secret sauce behind this? They spent like 2 years on this project, and they said them like, no, is it like, the diversity? Is it about the seniority versus junior? I'm like, is it the people with the best process, right? None of them. The best engineering teams were the ones where each and everybody in the team or in the room were speaking equally. I'm like, these are the guys have the ideas. You got to create the safety and security for them to say they can share bad ideas, they can share wrong ideas, but they have a space and a safety to that. Like, no idea is a bad idea. So that is where I'm like, great things happen. Encouraging people to speak up in the rooms or on the stand-up calls virtually would allow a very different level of participation and inputs from the engineers.
Great point. I'm wondering if I should even ask you this follow up, right? Which is, can a non engineer do some of this stuff? Can, let's say, a founder who's managing their first 3 or 4 developers, can they do all of this stuff, right? I mean, what are some principles that you can offer to non engineers? If I'm a founder, if I'm working with my first 3 or 4 developers, I don't have a VP engineering or I don't have a CTO, what are some do's and don'ts for me?
Yeah, it happens a lot of times. They have one of the thing I would say is definitely they can manage it. The first choice I would encourage them is try a low code, no code solution. Now, the low code movement is going big, especially for this reason, what you asked right now. There's a lot of stuff that you can build out without engineers. In the beginning, especially, I wouldn't say that like, no, you cannot do it every time. You can spin up a website, just like, you can do a lot of if this, then that. I'm like, no, lot of low code automation tools out there in the market. First choice is to use any of those things without the help of engineers, and most of these are very self-explanatory, mainly built for non-technical people. Even the stuff that you're able to do, like database, is what we call the most complex databases are now in the form of Airtable, which a non-technical person can use. How Zapier builds a lot of zaps. So a lot of no code, low code stuff can be used. That is one I would say that's the first choice. Second choice, when you do not have VP of engineering, I would always encourage to have an advisor. I know it's very hard to hire a VP of engineering in early stage, but having a technical advisor whom you can always give ESOPs or like find some ways. And if you're solving an interesting problem, you can bring in amazing advisors who are always excited about the space, problem space, and they are the ones who should be interviewing what kind of people you're going to be hiring, what kind of architecture you're going to have, what you're going to be building first through code, what you're going to be building through alternate no code solutions, right? So you should use an advisor. Is I highly recommend. You don't know if you're going to hire a Java engineer or a Python engineer. What do you do as a non-technical founder, right? Even technical founders, I'm like, we struggle with some of these choices in many things. So having that, it takes a lot of time to learn. You can learn, but it takes a lot of time to learn. And this generic advice is not going to help specific situation. That is where I'm like, no, I urge bring in some advisors who have been there, like who scaled startups to kind of 0 to 1. They will help you a lot. And then eventually hire your first engineer who will kind of set things for you, and he or she will continue to hire more engineers. And then you have a strong foundation and you're not making very wrong choices thinking, oh my god, I wish I knew this, I wish I had one engineer who told me this before. And then you cannot fire your first engineers. They're the best engineers most of the times. So that is what I would say: low code, no code, to get a technical advisor, technology advisor, and make sure you're making a wise choice from early on rather than investing.
Right.
I've seen some founders who hired like 4 engineers, 5 engineers from outsourcing company without knowing what exactly they want. They explain their problem to the outsourcing company. I've seen very early stage founder bootstrap. They gave our project, the whole idea, to an outsourcing company. And they said 6 people, 6 months. Then it went to 8 people, 12 months, and then it became very expensive for them. And end of the day, they regret most of the decisions they have made about the technology choices and the product features they have built, right? Because they waited for 12 months to get the product out, but it's not agile. It went into a waterfall model because whatever the founder thought was great was given to them, and they ended up giving all the mocks, wireframes application, but no agile iteration did not happen, and it becomes costly mistakes when you do not have a proper technology advisor or somebody from a tech background.
So, in that same vein, right, what are some things to look for in early engineers? The first few engineers that you hire, What are some intrinsics that they should have? What are some non-negotiable qualities that these folks should have?
Yeah, first, non-negotiable, I would say, is ownership. They should not be like at 9 to 6, because founders are not, and like, no, these are the people who should be really passionate about what you're doing and very excited about solving a problem that the startup is trying to solve. And like, no, they should be looking at building it for now, not for the long term. Right. So if they have the MVP, we see a lot of times, I'm like, no, people come from large enterprises, and like, they come in to start the startup. They find some gaps in the large companies. They want to build a startup to fix some gaps in the product, right? And they come in and like, it becomes very hard to kind of tell them, hey, I don't need this level of process. I don't need this level of architecture. I don't need this to be scaled to a million people. I just need it to solve right now. I need to test the feature, right? So they need to have that startup mindset about delivering fast, and that startup mindset about like, kind of solve for today, but still I'm like, in a stable way, not thinking of scalability or something at this immediate point as a startup, right? Because you're more of a product market fit stage where you want to validate your ideas than scale it
Right.
for a million people. So one is ownership about solving it, like, do whatever it takes to solve it. Two is the biggest one is a MVP mindset.
Right. All right. With that context, let's talk about Insightly. What was that aha moment for you when you said, why hasn't anyone solved this problem yet? And how do you go from idea to product to company with Insightly?
Great. I always enjoy sharing these stories. So first of all, I'm like, I was working for large companies, and then like, got into some startups in the valley, which got acquired and then went public. During this journey, I've seen a lot of engineering teams. We also acquired companies ranging up to $200 million. And during this time, I ended up managing a lot of remote engineering teams in the US. And then after that, we ended up as part of my previous company, Shortlist, where I was a CTO. I was managing the teams in India and Africa from Silicon Valley, and it was always managing remote engineering teams. But when the pandemic happened, every engineer is like a separate team. It's not like 3 teams or 5 teams anymore. It's like if you have 20 engineers, it's like 20 teams, right? Then I was thinking, I'm like, yeah, no, I think, there are a lot of choices about like, what you want to do with the future of, are we going to let engineers come back to the office, or like, are we going to make them continue to work from home or hybrid? All of these questions were popping up for all of us, right? And I said, okay, before I make a choice, how do I know that my team is going to be continuing to deliver the best and the productivity is going to be the best? Where is it going to be? Is it going to be work from home, or is it going to be a hybrid, or is it going to be everybody back to office? So then I said, okay, how do you measure productivity in the first place? Big companies say our productivity went up, our productivity went down, and all of those things. But I said, how do you measure productivity in the first place? I went in search of this answer for my own company, for my own team, when I was a CTO prior to this. And talking to 60 to 70 engineering leaders, I realized a lot of people are facing a similar challenge. And larger companies with 800,000 people are building something internally, and smaller teams like even up to 300, 500 engineers, they want to solve it, but it becomes a distraction to solve it for them. Then realizing, I'm like, no, okay, what is the status quo? How do you do it? Then, we're all using Jira dashboards, but Jira itself has two fundamental problems. One, there is no Jira hygiene. Two, everything is estimates. And I said, okay, but that's not the truth, but that's the closest we can live with. I said, okay, this got to change. And I said, okay, there is a lot of research that's coming around Dora metrics. I'm like, no, Google is investing a lot into developer productivity, all of the DevOps research and all of those things. That got me really excited about the space to say, like, no, it started to standardize the metrics. And it started to say, this is how you can tell your team is elite engineering team. That is where I'm like, I said, well, the whole thing is very subjective, where you don't have standardization of metrics, where there's lack of visibility into what's happening in the team in terms of people and process. I thought like, no, start with visibility and bring in a data-driven culture. And I hacked a solution together, just like, some simple solution while I was managing a team, and ran it by my team. The aha moment was, there was half of the information or the insights that I got of my hacked MVP product were simply completely per my gut decisions, whatever I was thinking. And the remaining half of them were completely mythbusters. They were not what I was thinking. I was always thinking I have to invest in CI/CD, but actually I have to, and I see that like there were a lot of area of improvement in requirement stage, where people were kind of going back and forth because they were not spending enough time discussing the problem or discussing the solution. And that was like a very big game changer. And I said, okay, a couple of friends, CTO friends, I said like, no, hey, this is what I have. I'm like, no, this is what I'm finding. What do you guys think about it? Okay, let me try. And they all gave some similar version of feedback. Okay, there is always aha moment here in the data. This is very interesting. And talking to them, I said, some of them said this is a big problem. I said, okay, now you said this was a big problem. Do you think I can build a startup around it? And they said, yeah, of course. I said, would you invest? Right? Saying yes is very different. And then, would you put your money? And very surprisingly, they said yes. And engineering managers from Amazon, Google, Twitter, Notion, all of these guys started to cut checks and started to say, and I was not, I did not have even a company registered at that time, honestly. And people were ready to give all of these checks. I said, okay, hold on, now let me go build a company around it. And the whole thing, very organically, I got in touch with the Together Fund, where SaaS was just like at the best moment of India, building India for global, with Freshworks going public by Girish Mathrubootham. And we got in touch with him. It was a very exciting moment to say, hey, we want to build in India for global. And, they have just taken a company public. And it was a very true partner for Insightly in many ways. And they invested in us. And then by the time the money hit in the bank, I was not even full time at Insightly, because things happened so fast, so organically. Got me excited, got the whole support from the ecosystem very fast. Being in the US for over 15 plus years, I have very, very less network in India. And the way things moved, how everybody jumped in to help was really amazing and very impressive about the startup ecosystem in India, both from the VC side and both from the startup founder community. Is really very helping and very empathetic ecosystem, I would say. So that's how we started the company. January is when we started, and we started to hire engineers. Most of the engineers who worked with me in the past continue to work from there, switch companies. My CEO, of course, supported us to kind of poach people from my previous teams. And we built the product. And today we are helping companies with as small as 50 engineers, and also helping companies as big as 800 engineers today with the product what we have. In a very short span of 6 months, we've been doing that, generating some six-figure revenue.
Fantastic. I'm curious about how you kind of sell Insightly to engineering leaders, right? Because I know from experience that people can live with a lot of pain. And often when you're creating a new paradigm or showing them how to do something slightly differently, there is a reluctance to acknowledge the problem itself, let alone even trying to solve it. So how are you creating that urgency for someone to buy Insightly? What is the trigger point? And how does Insightly go from being a nice to have to a need to have?
Definitely, I think I don't have the best answer. I'm still trying to figure out the best answer on how do I sell Insightly to the engineering leaders. But usually I ask them a few fundamental questions to say, when you miss a deadline, do you know if you have taken the right steps so that you don't miss it next time? Or did you know the real root cause of the problem? Or when you knew that you missed a deadline, how soon did you know about it? Did you know about it like a week sooner, or like a day sooner, or on the day of the release? And I said, when you keep adding engineering teams, do you know you're delivering more, or do you delivering fast? And then people start to give subjective answers. I said, do you have any data to support your answers? And then, that's where I'm no, I said, what metrics you track? And then, why the existing metrics and the status quo is not sufficient for you to kind of make these data-driven decisions. And then, we tell exactly the research that goes behind Insightly, in the metrics that Insightly uses, more outcome-driven metrics, more team-based metrics, and how it really empowers the engineering teams. And tell them, no, see, the best elite engineering teams, if you see Facebook, Google, Amazon, all of these guys, even Netflix, all of these companies use engineering productivity tools internally. They create the teams internally. And companies, startups, and mid-sized companies, they cannot afford to build these kind of internal tools or teams. And that is where, build versus buy makes more sense. And no, then we say this is how, Insightly can be a great SaaS solution as an offering. And finally, I'm how do you create the urgency? It's less about an urgency. It's more like, just to pick an analogy, when we were all living in the non-smartphone era, we never knew what a smartphone would look like. But the moment we got iPhone, I'm no, when they were doing all these advertisements, there were such a long line at Apple stores, right? As if somebody was giving it for free. And then the moment people purchase the smartphones, it's very, very hard to kind of go back to the traditional phones, correct? So we give a free trial of Insightly so that, people see the insights that they get out of this data or the tool. And then we really wanted to see the value when they use a free trial. No code, 5-minute integration. It's very easy for them to set it up and running. And then, people see this. And then, idea is to make them fall in love and see the value of our product, and then continue to use it. And very interestingly, I'm when it comes to urgency, when people say, hey, I do not have a budget for this, and I thought about I really like the product, but I do not have a budget for it. I said, okay, do you think I can stop the free trial? No, let me go back and check again, maybe if we can find a way to get this done. And then then people continue to make it happen. So once you get used to the data and the insights and how you turn your discussions in your meetings in a very data driven way, it's very hard for people to go back to the traditional ways of discussions and decision making process. So that's what I would say. It's more than an urgency. It's see this once, and then you'll see the value what you've been missing out.
Let's talk about data and insights, right? I think, all of us are in a bit of a data glut. We are looking at dashboards and reports all the time, but our capacity to respond to some of this data is pretty limited, right? I mean, it's limited by bandwidth and, of course, our immediate priorities. How do you transform some of the insights that you generate into relevant action points for these folks to act upon, right, and make a tangible difference. And here again, can you share some examples as well?
That is definitely, when data became super cheap, storage became cheaper, we started to create a lot of data, right? Like never before. When you have tons of data, gigabytes and petabytes of data for everything that we do, the easiest thing was dashboards. And when we build dashboards, now even dashboards are very overwhelming. Everybody has Tableau and ClickView, and there's a Tableau dashboard for everything. But when you're actually sharing these dashboards, you never share a dashboard by itself to any executive, or when you're sharing it with any stakeholder. You always write some narrative around it to say, hey, sales went up or engineering productivity went up. I'm like, no, the scope increased, the releases moved faster, or we released more stuff, right? Whatever it is, you write some narrative and a story around the data, and you say, because of XYZ, we would like to do A and B. What do you think we should do, right? So conversations are how you kind of share dashboards. And similarly, for even Insightly, dashboards is just the foundation, but on top of it is what we want to build is actionable insights, what we call it. And these actionable insights are generally to tell that, what problem happened and what was a symptom for this problem, and what is the diagnosis, and what you can do about this problem, and if you don't solve this problem, what can happen. So very small example, like you asked, right? We can say team alpha missed a deadline last week because of increased rework, and this is mainly coming from scope changes, and it's causing burnout. So when you say they missed the deadline, you also add a data point to it that says, they missed the deadline because they had to rework on the same stuff again and again, probably because no, they did not get it right the first time, or there was a lot of code review feedback, they want to get it better code, or there was a requirement change or UAT feedback. Any of these things are causing the team to burn out because, either they have to meet the deadline or work hard, right? So this is the framework that we use internally to generate these insights. And the action they can take about it are more about, most of the times, either they are in the form of a best practice to say, this is how you kind of create a well-defined requirements. So requirement, just having a Jira ticket in a to-do swim lane is not sufficient, but calling it a well-defined Jira ticket that is approved mutually by both the product manager and the engineer is more important. So we create those best practices, and then we want the either the action could be about sharing a best practice, or action could be about having a discussion to say, what were the problems, what do you think we could have done better, in a very data driven way. This story was too big for us. One person has to work on it for 2 weeks, and we didn't have a way to share the work because the story was too big, and there was scope creep here, and we did not have any way to kind of share the work or distribute the work, and there's no way for us to meet the deadline. So the insights are that would help at this probe these kind of conversations, and the actions are something that would allow them to get better over a period of time.
Interesting. So, $1 million funding raised, six-figure revenue, early customers. What do you have planned in the next 18 to 24 months? What is coming up? What should we look out for?
Yeah, a lot of exciting stuff in the roadmap. The actionable insights, what I said, is very, very hard to build because there is no one-stop shop, or there is no generic advice to achieve these things. One of the things that we are working on is creating, you always have a marketing playbook and a sales playbook, but not really an engineering playbook. What if somebody wants to move from a monthly release to a weekly release? What should an engineering team do when you're scaling from 5 to 10 or 10 to 20? What are the DevOps tool choices they should be making? So all of these things are in the form of blogs, podcasts, webinars, and all of those things, not really in a very actionable playbook format. And we are creating this engineering playbooks where people who have seen scaled teams from 50 to 100 will be writing these playbooks. So anybody who's going to be scaling from 50 to 100 will be able to consume these playbooks. So these playbooks will be a real takeaway for the engineering community. And these playbooks will be embedded into the product to generate these actionable insights, to say, hey, these are the potential problems, these are the potential actions you could be taking, and this is the data that is backing up this particular decision. So getting that full thing in a single package is going to be really a game changer for engineering teams to say, this is how you're going to get where you stand today, and this is where you want to get to, and here is a clear playbook, go run it. In a simpler way, it's like an operating system for engineering leaders to build an elite team. That's what we want to build.
Amazing. We ask entrepreneurs on the podcast, what do you know about the market that you're building in? Let's say the developer productivity market, in your case. What do you know about this market that is invisible for people on the outside, right? If someone else is looking to build in this market, what are the two or three things that are non-obvious, non-intuitive that you have realized in the time that you've spent in this market so far?
Very difficult question, but I will try to answer it. But I also like the question. The fundamental thing that is actually missing is it's very hard to know how the teams are, within a company. You'll be surprised talking to a lot of companies when people are shifting from team A to B to C and all. There is no clear maintenance of the org chart or how people are in teams, because a lot of these teams evolve as they grow, and the generalists move to specialists, and people are moving, leaders are changing. So even the team structure is very, what I would say, it's if you ask, it's, there is no easy way to say your team structure which is up to date. When you do not have a clear team structure and you don't know the type of the team, it's very hard to get any visibility or any improvement, continuous improvement in the people and processes when you do not have that kind of ownership around the team. I was super surprised, but I've been hearing it again and again about who belongs to which team. That was a very different thing. The second insight I would say is more about the value of data. And there is always this apprehension, I would say, about, hey, can I use this kind of data driven insights to use in my team? Do you think my engineers would feel like somebody is a big brother monitoring? And that is how everybody starts, because of this been decade old problem without being any data driven solutions, right? And the moment they think that, they are also ready to take the risk. While they say that, they're also excited about seeing, okay, what is in it for me? And anytime I think, I'm when I talk to a leader, they say, hey, I don't want to try this because it's going to impact the culture. 80-90% of the time it turns out no, after discussing further, they turn out to say, yeah, let me try this product. They see the data and then they say, yes, I think this is okay. I'm going to talk it to my directors of directors, and then directors would say, yeah, I can use this data. So it starts from a no to slowly it starts to yes. Most people, their first reaction is no, I don't want it. And then they start to fall in love with insights. I think those are the two things I would say at this point, but I'm in search for more such insights for sure. Third one we have definitely seen, you have asked, which is about dashboards. People say, hey, I have a lot of data around dashboards, but tell me what I should do with it. And no, it's over communicated world, overwhelming information. So that is one of the biggest thing what we're seeing, and which is why we are building these insights and the action they could take on top of these insights.
So, a quick follow up on that, right? Before we wind up, I know it's been a long day and founder time is scarce and limited, so I really value it. So, this buyer for you, right? What are some unique attributes or characteristics of this buyer, right? And what can someone learn from this? So, if similarly they are pitching to engineering leaders, how should they be mindful of what their priorities are, challenges are? What are those things that easily resonate with them? What are some do's and don'ts?
Engineering leaders, general characteristics are somebody, they are trying to deliver the features, they're trying to achieve more than what they can, right? They're trying to deliver new features, also kind of fix the bugs that come along their way. And the pain points are more about how do you retain top talent in this time without burning them, and at the same time stay on top of your competition in terms of delivering the features without slowing down. How do you do this kind of magic? Is that is where what are the pain points I go through is burnout, team attrition. These are the people who are kind of struggling to kind of create a business case for to hire more engineers, or to ask for more time and delivering the features. So these are the pain points and what they usually go through, and where they do not have any objectivity around answers that form the business case for these things. They are our ideal customers. I'm no, and I've been those. I've been in all of those places. I'm no, I've been in those places where you have to make a choice. So
Right. Yeah. So before we leave you, any books or podcasts or resources that you would recommend to our listeners?
yeah, being mostly a founder-centric, startup-focused podcast, I think there are so many best practices everybody can follow, and but more than anything, being in a startup, tons of ideas come to us, and we have the resources at our disposal in one or the other way to kind of get those done. But I think the discipline is what matters the most, and the great habits is what makes a startup succeed, is what I believe. So there is a great book, Atomic Habits by James Clear. That is something I really,
Fantastic
really
book.
admire. And once you read that, right, no, then everything else can fall into place. That's how it feels, because everything is oriented around your good habits. It could be about how you run your sprints. It could be about what time you work out. It could be about how you release features, or it could be about how often you send your investor updates. Everything is a habit. Atomic Habits is good one. And podcast, there is Tim Ferriss show. I don't know if you heard about it. That's something I often enjoy a lot, because I'm it has so much of variation about
Yeah.
the kind of topics they talk about. It's it kind of uncovers the unknown unknowns for me. That is one thing I like about it. And then there is a predictable revenue. I come from a technology CTO background, and revenue generation is a hot topic for me. And I enjoy those predictable revenue, which is more of a very tactical advice, similar to Startups Operator. The podcast, things are very storytelling style, and very tactical takeaways.
Fantastic. Hey Sudheer, thank you so much again for spending time with us. It was fascinating for me to understand all of these various facets. And thank you again for being on the podcast. All the best for everything that you have coming up.
Thank you so much, Roshan. I enjoyed every question throughout the podcast and wishing you all the best.
Hey, thank you so much. That's very kind. Thank you.
Take care, Roshan. Thank you. Bye.
If you enjoyed this podcast, consider subscribing and leaving a review on your favorite platform. Also get updates delivered straight to your WhatsApp inbox by clicking on the link in the description.